So my rule for myself in this particular presentation was that I was not allowed to talk about anything from my thesis, which means that we're going to have this really nice opportunity to actually consider where this is going. What's the broader picture of where human-computer interaction can think about work at large scale? And when I tell people that I do social and crowd computing, most people immediately jump to this as a model of what I do, where either what we've basically got is a simple like button or an articulated social network, and we're just putting that on top of how people interact, or we're paying people a cent or two in order to do some work. And what I hope to get across to you today are ways in which we can push far, far beyond those kinds of models and start thinking about what happens when we talk about designing at large scale for emergence, for tens, hundreds, thousands, millions of individuals all coming together trying to do things. And as something that's moving beyond the narrow picture that we've been talking about before, I'm actually going to speak broadly about three topics. I want to talk about where I think crowdsourcing can go if we push it that way. I'd like to talk also about social computing and the kind of role that it has in design for interactive systems and designing for social interaction more broadly. And then starting to push forward in some work that's really just starting in the last year or two about what happens when we consider crowds of people out on the web as a data source that we can then pull back together and use to rethink the kinds of interactive systems you and I use today. So with that agenda in mind, I'm going to start with the crowd. And this is a piece called The Future of Crowd Work, which actually just appeared at CSCW last week. So if you were there, this will look very familiar. But I'd like to sort of use this as an opportunity to sketch out what I see as some really interesting questions as we think about where crowdsourcing research needs to go. So before we start there, let's rewind. Early crowdsourcing research. So I think the model that is probably most popular or familiar if you're thinking about crowdsourcing is something like this. We have two distributed workers who are going to consider something independently, pass their work off to some third arbiter who's going to look at this work and adjudicate any decisions. And for me, something that's actually a pretty good encapsulation of this would be Greg Little's thesis work, where he introduced some of these notions of algorithms, where he actually got crowds to decipher this text. I certainly can't do it, but it turns out that by following this exact process, you can, and looping it, you can actually get all but I think one or two words correctly transcribed. This is actually feedback on an essay, if you can't tell. So this happened about 4 years ago. But when I talk about early crowdsourcing research, this is near history. In fact, this model and the bullet point dates more back to 1760. And here I'm going to talk about some work here that David Alan Greer wrote in a book called When Computers Were Human. This man, Neil Maskelyne, was the British Royal Astronomer. And he was charged with creating the first British nautical almanac, which is to say you'd be out at sea and you're a little lost. You want to be able to look at stars, do some calculations, and figure out where you are. And what did he do in order to accomplish this? He actually used the Postal Service. On the left here, you can see instructions that he mailed out. And on the right was a big spreadsheet that people would fill out in a distributed fashion, and then they would collect it, pass it to that third verifier, and they would use this to actually generate these charts that people use to navigate at sea. So really, we're talking many, many years ago, especially far beyond the computer age. But there are some really interesting parallels. One individual in particular who had some relevance to early crowdsourcing work is this gentleman. Does anyone know who this is by sight? Sorry? Edison? No? Two others? Taylor? Interesting guess, no? Yep.
The Wisdom of Crowds guy.
Suriecki?
No. The old one.
Dalton?
What?
Dalton.
Nope. This is one of the first people involved in this creation of the Nautical Almanac. Someone of some repute who you might know. His name is Charles Babbage. He was one of the first individuals who actually helped create this particular this almanac and managed it. Babbage, of course, being the person who created the difference engine, the analytical engine, the precursors of modern computing. And he, in fact, had several insights in this area that we still sort of try to reflect on today. I wish more people would take advantage of this. He noticed that two people doing the same thing in the same way make correlated errors. So the next time that you have 10 people on Mechanical Turk all do the same task and end up with the same kinds of blind spots, Babbage figured this out. And we as a crowdsourcing field still haven't managed this. Fast forwarding, I would say that the height of the original crowdsourcing work was in the WPA in the 1930s. So this was a project that actually created mathematical tables, just like with the nautical chart. This was mainly aimed at ballistics, so war usage eventually in the 1940s. And its height had 450 people in this gigantic room where none of them were actually, or very few of them were actually math experts. They distributed this process of doing these calculations, and the intelligence was built into the process in a sort of distributed cognition sense, that they were able to create these emergent behaviors. And they, at the height, had 450 people. They called them human computers because they were computing these mathematical functions. Turns out, another interesting thing here, this is the origin of the term computer. People were human computers. Eventually, the computer we know and love today came around and replaced these individuals. So they went down, the computer science that we have now begins, and it's only more recent history that we've started to see the crowdsourcing research that you may be familiar with. We started seeing people start to create iterative algorithms, thinking about what happens if you can program with individuals playing the part of some roles, some elements of that program, thinking about incentives, how do we get people to act in the way that we would want? How do we actually create systems that embed crowd intelligence? This is the work I've been spending a lot of time thinking about. Thinking about how algorithms can actually become smart computational managers, trying to make sure that people aren't wasting their time. And thinking more broadly about how we can take simple work and compose it into really complex tasks. Like here, CrowdForge tried to write simple Wikipedia pages. So that brings us to today. And what we want to ask is, what is the future of crowd work? And I think that there's one question that we've used as a useful instrument to try and ground this question, because often when I talk to people about this, the response is, oh yeah, we should make it cheaper, more optimized, higher quality. They say, okay, so what would it take if you were to have a kid right now, or you were to have one soon, or you have grandkids, between where we are now, such that you would be proud of that kid if they decided to full-time enter the crowd workforce? I would hazard a guess that if your kid came to you today and said, I want to spend all my time on Amazon Mechanical Turk, you're not going to be super happy with them. But I think we can get to this kind of a situation. And I ask this not as something that's unanswerable, but as something that tries to anchor the kinds of contributions we can make. And this isn't something that I asked by myself. In fact, this particular work was a collaboration. I think I was the only computer scientist in the group between cognitive science, management, design, sociology, economics. There's a lot of really interacting forces here when we think about what we call crowd work. And really what I want to try to, at one level, get across is a move from just paid microtasking to this notion of what crowd work might look like. And I'm going to broaden this definition just to say, any task that's completed online by a distributed elastic workforce in exchange for pay. And a lot of things can be covered by this. And in fact, Blinders argued that about 20% of our current American jobs could be sent down a wire. These are things like programming, accounting, marketing, even machine operators. Think of, say, like UAVs. And in particular, recent evidence for crowd work fitting some models for this suggests that its volume is going to end up being about $454 billion a year. That's about $91 billion hours per year, employing about 45 million full-time workers. That's a lot. Yeah.
Where there's a crowd of people, I go out and I pick one who does my job.
Yes.
Does that crowd work?
Yes. Under what I'm saying, if the pool of people who you're considering is in a sense distributed and elastic, yes. So here, Odesk has many, many individuals who could do this work. They're applying. You're choosing some number of them.
Person, not in dividing up the work.
Right. So yeah, I say nothing about this needing to be tightly decomposed tasks, which I think is actually important. Like we're not talking here about something that can be done in 5 seconds, 5 minutes. It might take a week. I think there is some sense in which crowdsourcing will continue to think about ways in which traditionally monolithic work can be distributed. But I don't think we have to talk about it with respect to being an employee at a company for 20 years, for example. Yeah.
So I mean, in a sense, it seems like a natural progression from like freelance work to like shorter. It's like micro freelancing.
In a sense, so that's sort of what I would suggest is you'll probably start to see an increase in the number of individuals who spend all of their time effectively as full-time contractors. I think in an ideal world, you have the ability for people who want to be able to run their own contract work as much as they want. Or if you're a stay-at-home dad, you can put in a few hours while the baby's asleep. Hopefully, they're just giving you more flexibility. Sorry?
Is the want-ads crowdsourcing?
Are the want-ads? In a sense, it's a crowd, yes. I mean, it's not online, which is sort of the, although Craigslist is, I suppose. I mean, I think I'm not trying to reframe existing practice. In a sense, what I'm trying to say is that it's actually already happening. And I'm just trying to put a lens onto it. So yes. It could be.
The question really in trying to push this is that interesting. Yep, want-ads online are better than want-ads offline for various reasons, but it's nothing new, whereas dividing up the task up into lots of little pieces and being able to assemble those globally, quickly, and so on is new.
I think what's actually new or interesting to me is not necessarily just that it doesn't need to be distributed into tiny pieces, but that technology is mediating the entire process. From everything from the hiring to the formation of the team to how the work is done, which is what we've so far thought about how to distribute it into small pieces. I think we have the ability, as this moves forward, to think about a much broader picture of what that might mean. We can come back to this. I'm very happy to be wrong.
The thing is, what you're saying is obviously true. The question is, trying to do research on it, is that too broad? And do you want to focus in on narrower pieces of that and say, this is what I want to really think is an interesting problem to solve?
So I'm going to rezoom back in just a moment to, I think, the kinds of problems that I think are solvable when you take this kind of a lens. So just to be clear of what I'm comparing this to, I think the current frame is something that looks a lot more like this. Amazon Mechanical Turk, that's framed a lot of our discussions around crowdsourcing. And transforming that a little bit into the model that you sort of see, you have small, simple tasks that are independent. Workers are undifferentiated. They're pseudonymous. Work is automatically aggregated. These are things like image labeling, speech tagging, those kinds of things. And I would be far from the first person to suggest that that can lead to negative outcomes. There's a risk of falling into this framing permanently. Six Silverman has talked about this, Lily Irani, Ben Peterson. And if you think about this, requesters are going to view workers as exchangeable, untrustworthy shirkers, and the workers are going to view these requesters as distant, capricious, having lots of power over your ability to do anything. So in a sense, what I'm trying to push back against is not necessarily the notion that things can be distributed into small parts, but that the notion that doing so can only be done in the particular way that we've done it so far. Because looking forward, the kind of work that we do is complex, it's creative, it's interdependent. You think about things like writing a news story, writing software, or even say like asking, could a crowd compose a symphony? Another kind of interesting question, because if you tried to do that right now, it would really not work. If everyone's generating their own stanza and you're trying to reassemble them, that might not be the thing you would try, but it is the way the model would map onto it. So just to talk about a few of the kinds of issues you would find, there's interdependencies between movements. You need to have expertise. People are going to drop out of any online system. So what can we do about this? So this is one place where we're starting to see why it's actually useful to have an interdisciplinary perspective here. In fact, the group of us that were discussing it decided to draw on two different perspectives together. One of those being distributed organizations in the management literature, as well as notions from, say, distributed computing here in computer science. And it is that a lot of the challenges they face actually synthesize quite well. If you think of it in the following way. So the first thing you have to do is often decompose a task. So if you're planning a conference, you need to split up, say, finding a venue from reviewing papers. But if you're Google, you need to actually split up crawling the web. And likewise, you need to put together a team. So again, if you're a conference chair, you need to find respectable academics or coercible friends to help take on roles. And if you're Google, you have people taking on different roles as well. So say a master node in a MapReduce process coordinating other computers. And then we have workflows that need to happen. So finally, again, we have potentially multi-stage review processes in these conferences. And in computing, we call these algorithms, things that actually will often pipeline work between different stages. And each of these really has things that can happen with crowd work. There are a lot of different challenges that we need to solve. I'm not going to talk about all of these. In fact, I'm actually just going to focus broadly on three categories of what we can think about in terms of opportunities for research with crowd workers, with the crowd work itself, and with the role that computation has to play. I'm really going to just focus on one or two of them. And this is hopefully just to get us all thinking about what might be possible. So starting with crowd workers, I'm going to focus on a couple of tied together elements on credentials and education. Because when you try to get a job today, you probably say things like, hey, I graduated from Stanford, or I work for Google. And these actually carry quite a lot of meaning. If you look at crowdsourcing at the same time today, this is Odesk. People trying to signal their expertise. It looks like Netflix and eBay. There's this collapse toward high ratings, people signaling their abilities like they're on Craigslist. So saying, typing in all caps, saying my official job title is being a web rock star. And I just refuse to believe that the future of crowd work is going to be saying that I have 4.2 stars out of 5 as a composer. So we can start to pitch toward some end goals here.
Hey, Michael.
Yeah.
Why not?
Because I think that that's actually collapsing. First of all, everyone has 4.2 stars out of 5. And I think that's a problem. I think it's one that we could solve technically, but it's also not clear that it has the right dimensions of variance captured in it. I think you could, at the end of the day, try to come up with a single number, and maybe you could for composition in particular. But it's not clear that it's the same number that you want to be comparing people who are programmers on.
So here's why I ask, is that I think there are some skills that we value the multidimensionality of success more than others.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like one potential future is that Mechanical Turk and friends just keep on keeping on, and that the kinds of things that they do now are the kinds of things they do in the future. And so, an 87% happiness rate, or whatever you want to call it, is a reasonable measure.
Sure. I think that if we do nothing, that's likely what's going to happen, is that micro tasks will continue to be micro tasks, and we'll never really see a growth, or we will see several abortive tries to grow out of that until someone really gets it. I think that if we do this right, the Mechanical Turk in its current instantiation, whether will get replaced by something far better, either Amazon does it or we do it, making the current Mechanical Turk the Friendster of paid crowdsourcing. So, yeah.
It also seems like if you have a single metric like this, you're pushing towards homogeneity rather than diversity. And for something like being a composer, I'd say diversity is an important goal as much as quality.
So, take that as a point. I want to hire somebody for advertising labels. You want to hire him to commission a work for the symphony or for example, art gallery.
Yes.
So I would go ahead and just wager a slightly different take on this, which is go ahead and do this. It'll probably get ignored anyway. So the whole point is like if I want to hire a programmer, I might care that 4.5 versus a 3.5. I care, but I'd also need a lot more details about the multidimensionality of the task. And since we're going to blow past this anyway, let's get to where the interesting stuff is. Where does the action live?
Well, so that becomes like GPA and graduate school applications.
Yeah. So you might use it as a filter of some sort, but it's hardly what you use to make the decisions.
So this already exists, by the way, on Odesk. People get star ratings, and I would claim that I think Odesk would also claim that there's a lot more to be done. So I'll pitch an alternative view here, which is I think it would be possible to create these kinds of reputation mechanisms that should be as straightforward to deploy and interpret as what we have today in terms of degrees and affiliations. I think there are ways that we can think about how to scale that out to many more individuals than we have today. So this would be the first kind of specific yet out there kind of millennial goal that I think we might think about working toward. Another tied to it is education, because if you want to get credentialing, you need to think about education. And especially in the last couple of years, you've seen the internet really playing a big role in self-driven learning. And CrowdWork has the opportunity to empower this process. So this person is actually creating their first sort of Arduino prototype. And so what I'd love to think about is ways in which we can help this person go from their first Hello World program all the way out to becoming an expert, and actually support that at the level of the kind of work that they want to do. So to throw something out there that's probably a little more strongly worded than I would actually try to pursue, could CrowdWork actually become equivalent to, or at least a core part of education? So you think about the job that this person wants to do involves learning C, so she turns to an online course to do that. And the course is able to use some simple actual work as assignments for the course if they're fulfilling learning goals. As she completes the course, she can use the credentials from that course to actually take on more newer, more interesting work. So I think that we can actually tie these things a lot closer together. So that would be a second kind of goal that we would be able to push toward. Moving to work, so from workers to work. Hierarchy is a really interesting one, because we could actually pitch something that is clearly not true right now, which is CrowdWork being as well managed as the best managers. And I like how Nikki Couture puts this, so I'm going to crib from him here, saying that this guy's a pretty good manager. His name is Tim Cook. He's the CEO of Apple. And he got paid a lot last year. He does a lot of things for Apple. He's streamlining their supply chain. He's improving their workflow. He's thinking about products. And we could again ask, could a crowd worker actually bring that much value to an enterprise? And maybe it's not a single worker. Maybe actually you have this distributed leadership model where some folks are good at different things like providing feedback, providing direction, supply chains, rewards, sanctions. If we pull everyone together, maybe we could actually create a self-managed enterprise in an interesting sense. And we could look at successful examples like online communities like Wikipedia, open source software, that might start to provide some models for this kind of thing. So hierarchy also, I think, touches on workflow. And as I sort of started to intimate, the workflows in crowdsourcing right now look a lot like this. Very undifferentiated single track or single stage. And as researchers, we've started to create these kinds of things. This is Nikki Couture's CrowdWeaver. That starts to get a bit more complicated. And to be honest, as researchers in this area, we get really excited about this kind of thing. Until you look at what real workflows look like. This is a TV station that's and has a workflow for producing programming. So a new show. And the workflow looks like this. Yes?
Is this a document that they maintain?
That's a great question.
Directing it, or is this an analysis from an outside source?
I am not certain. We'd have to go back and yeah.
Is this a good thing?
Well, you could ask, let me flip that around, is could you produce a TV show with less than this?
Yeah.
Possibly. I think it would certainly be more than a single stage, put a task out on Odesk saying, make a TV show, right? So I think at some level there's going to be a connection between them. So I think how complex it is an open question. But certainly we should think about ones that have goals that are at least this complex. Things that are as high quality, maybe faster, more dynamic than the kinds of workflows you and I use today. And in order to get toward this, I think this is where, again, we can think about how computing might play in terms of ways of creating sort of shared libraries, design patterns, saying that, well, if you want to actually get this kind of result, this kind of approach tends to work. And here, now we can turn back to the management literature to see where these kinds of things come from.
Isn't the essence of these procedures that they're actually not like computer procedures, they're open procedures, where the people themselves repair? If somebody goes on vacation and the person designing the machine, the procedure doesn't even know about that, but somebody covers for somebody else, and so the procedures are not fixed in computer science.
So this is where crowdsourcing right now tends to fall over, to be honest, is these workflows that we've created so far have strong assumptions in them. And when those assumptions start breaking down, then they completely fall over. But I think when you start to get at this kind of scale, you need these, someone might call it a self-healing system, right? But I think in an organization, you have someone covering for another person.
Right, but the essence is that it's at the level of the worker that does those repairs, rather than the level of the hierarchy.
Sure. It doesn't have to be that way. I would say maybe not. There are interesting models, right? One could say that one model of crowd work would be to say that each piece in this could, in theory, be replaceable with someone else who does this thing just as well. So if I'm going to go on vacation, another crowd worker might come in who's just as good at audio programming, that kind of thing. So in some ways, we could actually keep the situation flowing even more smoothly. But we'll probably fail a lot in order to get there. So I'll pitch one other thing about platforms here. And I think the platforms are a really interesting opportunity for us to get involved. So far, we've largely said, yes, Mechanical Turk is out there, or Odesk is out there, and we're going to just figure out how to involve it in our own endeavors. But I think if you pitch forward, you might be able to look toward a future where crowd platforms would either coexist with, or even in a strong version, replace firms. So something where you could create a flash startup that would only exist for an afternoon, or a team of expert crowd workers who consult for thousands of jobs over a period of years. I think this is a kind of situation that we might be able to start aiming for and saying, what would it take to get there? And this is where, and the reason I think this is important is this is where I pitch my weak Whorfian hypothesis of crowdsourcing, which is that the platforms have a really strong influence on the kind of work that actually gets done there. I would claim that given how Mechanical Turk was designed, it was somewhat inevitable that it was going to lean toward small tasks, low pay, people not being able to talk to each other. But if you create a different platform, you'll get a different kind of outcome. And I think that we can create these kinds of platforms to create new kinds of work. So, and furthermore, there are some of these challenges that only can be solved at the platform level. If we want to, for example, say, if you do good work, if you're contributing well, we promise that in expectation, you'll make the amount of money that you want to. This is something that really only the platform can start to mediate. And likewise, making people feel comfortable spending a fair amount of time there in terms of long-term employment. Right now on Odesk, you're sort of listing from job to job, which doesn't feel very comfortable, I would claim, for many people who want to feel a little bit more solid in their employment status. And this is already happening. If you look at UC Berkeley, they spun out MobileWorks, which grew out of crowdsourcing research. I think we really can influence and build these platforms and have a lot of impact. So this is a super brief overview. I think some of the interesting opportunities that are out there for us in crowdsourcing work moving forward in terms of the workers, the work, the computation. And I say brief because we covered about a third or a quarter of the kinds of things that are discussed in the paper that we wrote about this, which I believe was the longest CSCW paper in history, now that they went to a continuous length format. And there are many, many opportunities. So A, we're missing things here. And I would encourage you to tell me what we're missing, because we're all going to benefit from that. And also to think about how you can contribute. Because whatever you bring to the table, whether you have expertise in qualitative work, system engineering, social psychology, there are things that you can help us do. So before I move on, I'll just sort of close out this part of where I'd like to see crowdsourcing research start to move with, again, drawing back to this question of how do we create a positive social outcome for crowdsourcing? And I think we do that by starting to create the platforms, the workers, the computational structures that allow you to feel comfortable and have a growth potential in this kind of system, rather than just thinking about how to optimize given the strata we already have. Yeah?
Interesting to think about this applied to politics or democracy. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, in a sense, I think democracy is a great example of a crowdsourced system. When you vote, for example. And there's a bit of a model here that's implicit in what I've been talking about, where the technology is taking a strong hand that I think many democracies would chafe at a bit. I think we chafed enough at having the Supreme Court decide an election for us. Now having an algorithm say, actually, you should go over here and vote for this guy seems perhaps less than ideal. But thinking about ways to actually get people to have conversations, to come to consensuses, there's a lot of work about getting local groups to have discussions together. If everyone believes in the system, then I think you could do it. Crowd work, in a sense, because it's paid, has an element of coercion that is not really, or lightly incentivization, that's not present in democracies. Yeah.
Well, in politics, there's a different dimension, maybe in there, I'm sure, which is historically, there's been a lot of discussion in labor markets about the problems with things like piecework and work at home and contract instead of employment. And they're all sort of based on the assumption that employers are going to maximize profits rather than employee benefit, and that many jobs, maybe programming isn't one of them, many jobs, keeping employees happy is a relatively small term in terms of profits. And that this kind of platform is going to, in some sense, cut off the ability of governments in general to regulate. So minimal hourly wage as opposed to piecework, benefits as opposed to contract, and so on.
Yes.
Do you see that as a problem?
I think that, with the research hat on, I think we need to fix that before regulation needs to step in to do it. Because once regulation steps in, we may not make the right decisions. We may be more reactionary than thoughtful. So my goal here would be to say, well, if that's the concern, how do we actually design the system, the platform, the socio-technical environment to avoid that problem?
Profits.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, at the end of the day, I think Amazon, for example, cares more about the requesters than they do about the workers. However, without the workers, they have no requesters anyway. So I think that at the end of the day, you have a lot of businesses, and businesses have bottom lines that depend on the people who are paying them. But maybe this is why research is important in this space, is that we can streak out into directions that may not be driven by profits immediately, but that would, in the long term, help profits. Just a thought.
I think the moral obligations that you have to workers depends on your model of what role crowd work plays in their life, which is why I think your opening question is really interesting. That if your model of Mechanical Turk is somebody gets their health care from something that they do outside of Mechanical Turk.
Yep.
And Turk is basically a different way of wasting time besides watching sports. Then, if you get some spending money out of it, great. But on the other hand, if you're expecting your church work to carry you into retirement and pay for your medical treatment, then that's a very different thing.
Right. And I think we should be ambitious and think about what, we'd like someone to be able to spend all their time doing this. If you view today's contractors, people who create their own consulting firms, as the leading edge of this, what it would take between here and there to get an order of magnitude more individuals participating in that. It's sort of, for me at least, a motivating question, if not an answer I have quite yet.
So I think there's room in this for other kinds of organizations that are use it that are like an overlay on top of this infrastructure. Shops that hire contractors to other companies but still pay those contractors benefits, even though the contractors are paid an hourly wage on the short term. So you can imagine this enabling something similar.
Right, and I think many consulting agencies do this, right? Where they'll provide the health care and the guarantees of employment, and then it becomes the role of the organization to make sure there's enough work to do. So yeah, interesting models everywhere. Yeah?
Question about quality control actually. So actually based on my experience in Amazon and Turk, there's a kind of a redundancies on making submission of the task actually. For example, if I make a mistake on some work, then the other guy should be involved to make a correction. So my question is, there is a lot overhead for kind of handling redundancies of tasks and to make a quality assessment. And another question is kind of confidentiality or reliability of the workers. Maybe some kind of a reputation can solve the problem, but still, I think we have some kind of showstopper to use the crowdsourcing to the general task.
So what was the question? The second question, just a comment?
Second question is kind of reliability of the workers.
Yes.
Yeah, also some kind of confidentiality of the task actually.
Confidentiality of the task?
Yeah.
From the perspective of the workers, so they can't know what they're looking at?
Yeah, so from the, some company's point of view, so they use some crowd workers, then their information can be leaked to the crowds.
Sure. So I think you see what companies are doing now is actually creating crowds within their organization. They're paying contract workers or their large-scale contract outlets, and they have everyone sign an NDA, which is an interesting model. And I think one that, but the challenge you're pointing out is going to become even more present. If you have a model where even a startup can actually reach out to a designer for a few hours for some feedback, or a front-end engineer for help debugging something, you're going to have a lot of high throughput confidentiality breaches, basically. And thinking about how people actually treat each other and the respect for some always changing organization is hard. But yes, and redundancy, back to your original question, I think that, why do we have the redundancy? It's because we maybe don't trust everyone, or maybe you want, the good reason to have redundancy is you want a lot of opinions. The bad reason is because you don't trust any single person. And I'm in favor of the first one. I think the second one, I would rather pay someone 5 times as much and then do good work rather than need to pay someone 1/5 as much and get 5 of them. So I'll turn for a bit to opportunities in social computing. And I say this because I think that crowdsourcing really only gets us so far. This is going to be a section on friend sourcing in particular. And why friend source? Well, crowdsourcing gets us pretty far, but it can, and it in particular it helps with things that have massive scale, trying to label every image on the web, or identify good links, or identify every Buffy the Vampire Slayer episode ever. And yet, it struggles when only a few people are qualified. So Wikipedia has something, it's either 1/100% or 1/10% of all of its views become edits. And if you only have 1,000 or 10,000 views total, you're really going to struggle to get anything to happen. Just as a sort of facetious example here, we can ask Yahoo Answers what to get my friend for their birthday, and less facetiously actually do so and get no responses. Sorry? Yeah, unless Leslie happens to be there. And so, in particular, I think this points to a large number of applications where things need to know about the individual, maybe about you or about others who would be using it, things like Q&A routing, news feeds, My Sixth Sense, which is trying to take a news feed and personalize it to your own tastes. And crowds just really can't help you very much there. But there is a set of people who can. In particular, I point to your friends, your family, and your colleagues. It's a much smaller set of people. But if we could actually get them to participate at a higher rate, then we might still actually be able to succeed. And this is the idea behind friend sourcing that I'd like to pitch. To be specific, I think that one thing we might aim for is, given a person, to get a sort of weighted term vector of things that describe them. So given that we know about Greg Smith, what can we say about him? In particular, without asking him to sit there and tag himself the entire time. A first jaunt into this space was something called Collabio, which we actually deployed in the early days of Facebook applications. And it basically works out like a game of social family feud, where what you would do is, given a tag cloud of what Kurt here's other friends have said about them that's obscured, we try to guess what others have said about Kurt. Here I guessed Georgia Tech. 10 people have guessed that, so I get a certain number of points. We can continue to go all the way down on this list until maybe I would guess something like, eventually I'll guess his Twitter handle, Resurgence, that no one else has guessed, and then something new gets added to the tag cloud. And we can play this game, and in fact, as we do so, it'll scroll down here to the left. We identified Becky Grinter, who's a faculty member at Georgia Tech, knows Kurt far better than I do. So when a lot of people do this, you get tag clouds that look something like this. This is actually something like 1/5 of my own tag cloud. And it's interesting because people from a lot of different walks of my life have actually shared information about me. And so it's non-monolithic in the sense that it knows a lot of different perspectives about me. And I just want to point out that Collabio is one way to do this. I'm going to point out some things that I think didn't work so well. One is, do you want to actually encourage people to go after popular information? When we tried it the other way, in fact, giving more points the fewer other people who had said it, provided that at least one other person had, turned out there was no agreement, no points. And in fact, when you reward the common information, when people aim for the common stuff, they often miss. And that's when you really learn something. Likewise, bootstrapping untagged users, when you walk in and start this game, there's an empty tag cloud. Originally, we started just by effectively, this was before gamification, but it was effectively game options. Here are extra points if you're the first person. No one did this. Turned out that we could sort of do what Eitan Adar is now calling benevolent deception, and basically scrape a few tags off your profile, put them into this tag cloud for the first person, get them to try to match that tag cloud by attributing it to someone else who they don't know. And once they've done so, we remove the automatically generated tags and leave the ones that someone actually left there. So there's a lot that can be done here. In fact, just as we did it, we collected something like 30,000 tags on 4,000 individuals. Actually, a relatively smaller number of taggers, only about 800 of them participated. But as I'll get to, this might actually be a design opportunity moving forward. We ran some evaluation that I won't go into too much depth on, looking at whether these tags are accurate, whether they can be found elsewhere. And what we found was that these tags that were the most popular actually could be found, say, on Facebook or Google, things like MIT, where I did grad school. But the things that were sort of in the torso of this or in the longer tail were both accurate and not available anywhere else on the web. Which means that we can do all sorts of interesting things. Here, for example, we might allow you to actually explore your social network based on what your friends have said about each other, or compare people who are tagged with Georgia Tech to people who are tagged with Washington. And again, here we are actually relying not on the individuals to tag themselves, but to get the social network to tag each other. And here's why this is super useful. We can start to build applications like this. This was a sort of an early precursor of Aardvark in a sense, where I can say, where can I find lunch near the Palo Alto Research Center? And folks who get tagged with both of them, with Park, tend to show up. These individuals didn't tag themselves with Park. In fact, they may never have even played Collabio. But we're able to do this kind of question routing, relying on here just say 800 individuals who ended up being really active contributors to the platform. And so this is useful for across the network, but we could also, again, turn back to some of these personalized applications. Like here, scraping 30,000 items in an RSS feed over the course of a day. This is just sort of out of Google. Here's some random ones: X-Files, cars, PTR. And then we can start to just personalize these by using cosine distance on the tag clouds. This is, again, my tag cloud. And what you start to see is a much more relevant feed. Things about PhDs in HCI, information schools, nerd culture. This is a friend who's a doctor and a tenor in New York. Again, a different set of feed items. And a third one who's a friend who's a rock musician, basically. And you, again, start to see content that's relevant to that. So that's a first attack here. But we might be able to actually take advantage of existing social interactions instead of creating new ones. And I think this is an interesting perspective because now instead of thinking about, well, okay, how do we actually encourage people to install some application, get things to happen, can we ride on what's already happening? And I'll pitch one at you again today, which is about content sharing. This is something you probably have happen to you all the time. Hey, I saw this. This is actually relevant to something that you're doing. And it actually does tend to be fairly relevant, unless it's, say, coming from your grandma who's passing you something from 3 weeks ago. And we asked a couple questions. Who should we be enabling here? One option would be to just say, well, the sharers are people who are seeking out a lot of content. And in that case, we should actually be going after people who are these information brokers, the people on RSS feeds or Twitter. Another hypothesis might be that they're actually especially social individuals. So we want to identify people who are, say, central to a network or have high degree. And we can start to separate between these hypotheses. We ran a survey on Mechanical Turk with a large number of, about 40 questions, all on a scale, 4 scales, all Likert-style questions. And what we were trying to measure was the interest in eventually sharing content. So this is an example question off that scale. I often tell people I know about my favorite websites to follow. And we used it to try to predict things. We used the rest of them to try to predict their sharing interest. One was the seeking measure. Things like I often seek out entertaining posts on the internet. And then 2 notions of sociality. Drawing on Nicole Ellison and their friends' work on social capital, there are 2 types. One is bridging social capital. This is roughly the bowling alone kind of social capital, where you're trying to understand someone's interest in meeting new people, investment in their community, or bonding social capital, having a small number of friends who you really maintain tight relationships with. And what we started to see was that the seeking measures actually correlated much more strongly with the sharing than someone's sociality, which surprised me, to be honest. And in fact, adding the social capital measures to this regression only explained an additional 3% of variance, so went from 0.53 to 0.56. So we actually have some fairly strong evidence that the sharers that we can enable are really those who are seeking out a lot of content. And maybe some mixed results here that being interested in talking, in meeting people in general is still somewhat predictive, but having a few close friends really doesn't predict someone's interest in sharing. So maybe we can start to empower those heavy information consumers to actually create the same kind of content. And we can do that by going where they live, say in their RSS readers, and making this easier to have happen. So rather than trying to get everyone on Facebook to tag each other, let's actually aim at those few people who are extremely active and make it easier for them to share. Let's lower that activation barrier and try to address some of the inhibitions. So the recommendations just get inserted in line. Google Reader, if you're familiar with it, looks just like this. We've added this particular addition so that when you actually are reading an item, all you need to do is say, we recommend people who might be interested. And we say, OK, you click on that and then say now or later. And then it just sends an email saying, this person thought you might be interested in it. So it's directed content sharing rather than sort of broadcast like on Twitter. And by doing so, we can start to build these models again. So we see that 2 people share items with Rob, and we can just combine those documents to build up a profile of what Rob might be interested in. And when we see a new item, we can pull out this very basic bag of words representation, do some cosine distance, and identify the individual who's most likely to be interested in that kind of article. A few other things. We try to address some of these inhibitions. Have this person received a lot of information already today? How much are we sending them? Or did they already see it? Did someone else send it to them? Or am I overwhelming their inbox? Should I send it now or just say, I'll send everything all at once, maybe once a week? Something that was a sort of surprisingly effective to us was the email equivalent of a like button. The ability for someone to just click one button and say, thanks for sharing this. And the system would respond with a very simple email. 30% of what got sent through the system generated a thanks, which is roughly, by our counts, equivalent to the number of items on Facebook that get at least one like. But keep in mind here that rather than having your entire social network possibly giving likes, this was from a single individual who was probably receiving the content.
Hey, Michael.
Yes?
Experiment with a genteel way of having a I wish you didn't send this to me button.
So I believe there was a lot of discussion with this, and in particular ways to address the recommendations. Accidental disclosure was interesting. So, imagine that Sanjay shared with me some item relevant to, say, cancer for one reason or another. And if you're then browsing Google Reader and you see an article about cancer and I get recommended for it, there's all sorts of interesting questions there. I think that's the one that I would pick off first. But yeah, the genteel mute is also a good question.
You can like things and you can't dislike them. Somebody gave a talk here said that Facebook is the happiest place in the world. Nobody dislikes anything. I have a cousin who sends me stuff all the time, and I would love to say, please don't send me this kind of stuff. Right. You're a nice person, I love you, but please, not this kind of stuff.
So I believe what we allowed people to do was to silently mute themselves from the recommendations for a person. So let's say I'm sending you bad stuff. All you need to do is go into the system and say, stop recommending me for Terry. And then I would no longer appear. If you then still wanted to manually send me something, we of course couldn't stop you. But I think there is sort of this, we're trying to make it quietly possible to decline, or in a genteel way. I think we don't have a great answer there, but a first shot at it.
One of the reasons we email each other stuff like this is just a way of staying in touch. I email Terry stuff just a way of saying, hey, I was thinking about you.
Yeah. So there's these static elements.
And so it would be great to have a system help us figure out, well, what stuff could I send him to let him know I'm thinking about him that he also wants to read?
Right. Or endorsing what other people who actually have good taste have said. If Jeff has great taste for Terry, you can just say, yeah, me too. I liked that one too. Gilbert, yeah.
This may be something pretty idiosyncratic for me, but a lot of times I don't use the send this from this service link, and I just copy the link and stick it into an email, specifically because I don't like the fact that New York Times is tracking who I'm communicating with, or whoever it is. So I wonder, as you explore into these various side channels that people are using, and you say, oh, we can get all this information there, that sort of runs into other issues with why people are using those side channels in the first place.
And I'll reflect on some of these thoughts that came out of the group lens stuff about, do we want federated recommendation engines? Should I be able to keep private all of the knowledge that I'm sharing in a sense about my friends? Or is this something where we actually do better by sharing? Yeah.
Intermediated URLs in there that come back through your server so you can actually know how many they click on?
We do. Now, is that good? I'm not sure. There's some breach of privacy there. But yeah, this was for the perspective of running a user study, we really wanted to know. So yes, we proxied the URLs. So I'm going to turn one last time here to data. And I think there's a lot of opportunities here. And I think actually that I am sort of preaching to the choir to the extent that I think all of my other colleagues in this group already get this. But I'd like to pitch, again, one perspective here, which is why is it that crowd data might be actually opening up avenues for design of interactive systems that we might not have seen before. And one reason that might be is thinking about long-tail design. Traditionally, we've thought about this sort of 80-20 rule, trying to cover as much as we can and make everything else possible but not easy. You could also think about saying, well, actually, let's build a ship. And in that ship, we'll actually let the denizens of it organize it in such a way that it becomes useful for them. And I'll give you one example here on the web, where we've manually created answers for a small number of things. Answers or one boxes if you're Google, respond to queries like this, not just with results, but also with something that's been specifically designed. And this is really powerful because you can have movies, dates, stocks, but ultimately, and these are good because we know that they're actually removing the clicks from the results pages, meaning people are finding what they're looking for. And that once they figure out that one of these exists, people repeatedly trigger these things. But they really only exist for a small number of queries. The answers are high cost, you have to create them, high maintenance, you have to make sure they don't break. And really, search is dominated by uncommon things. In fact, you take a 6-month log of queries, fully 50% of those queries are unique. They only appear once, which is incredible when you think about it, given the number of times people are searching for Facebook. So you have a lot of things that look like this: molasses substitutes, increasing the volume on Windows XP, dissolvable stitches, what's the body temperature of a dog. What we started doing was creating tail answers, which, given that kind of a query, not only returns the results, but actually, again, starts to think about what it would take to design for a huge number of somewhat popular responses. And I mean somewhat popular in the following way. Weather in movies, clearly happening all the time. Asking where Kai is going to be in several years, probably not very popular and maybe not worth creating a specific result for. But there's this perhaps torso, you might call it, of the curve, where I think there's a large number of individuals who would be interested, but the volume is so large that you can't actually design for every single one of them. So there are also scenarios where there's probably not any structured information schemas yet, unlike weather or movies, and we don't want to actually dedicate teams to them. So we create these tail answers across what are empirically somewhat popular queries. Things like, how many calories are in a green apple? What's the mileage reimbursement for the IRS? How do you turn up volume on Windows XP? What temperature do you fry fish at? Yes?
How does that compare with a snippet that might be interpolated into the results?
So I won't talk about it today, but basically it's superior in the evaluation that we did. But you can also, I will briefly mention, you can use this kind of technique to create better snippets. So I'm not sure they're really in contention. So there are some typos here I want to point out. These aren't perfect, which is an interesting thing that happens when you allow sort of crowds to collectively influence the internals of a system. So now Microsoft, in this case, or Bing, says, here's our here's what Bing thinks the answer is, and it has a typo in it. Sort of an interesting kind of situation to be in. I'm going to briefly just give you a sense of how this is possible. And what I want to hopefully take away from this is that data is powerful, but it's also extremely noisy. And just like in machine learning, feature construction is often 90% of the game. Here, I think thinking about what the model is and what we need to filter out becomes just as important. We start with answer candidates, which is basically every set of queries that leads to a click on a single URL. So we can observe for a subset of individuals who have installed a browser toolbar, effectively their entire browsing path, because this is work done in collaboration with Microsoft, and they can do that. So we notice that all of these queries lead to a click-through from the result to a particular URL. And we have a lot of these things. So lots of other queries might lead through to a click-through on another URL. It's probably about the area code 410. And now we have to filter. And filtering is interesting. One thing we want to do is get rid of things like this. A lot of people who search for radio click on Pandora.com. That's not the kind of thing you actually want to provide an answer for. You actually want some sort of navigational result there. So what we start doing is trying to identify searches that have some sort of fact-finding nature. So we start looking for navigation behavior, query behavior, answer type. And this is a combination of statistics and heuristics, to be honest. So we start looking at the destination probability, what we call it. Basically the probability that you click through from a result and end your session. So here we have some notion that you're probably happy with what you found. Here you went on and were looking for something else, or you hit the back button. So in this case, very easy to calculate, 50% of the time, people who clicked through to this URL stopped there. And what we can start to do is filter out anything that has a low probability that searchers are going to end. I'm sorry, filter out things that have high probability that, I'm getting this backwards, filter out things where it's likely that once you get there, you're going to move on or go back. So we want to find things where people stop. And this is going to allow us to focus on queries where there's really a solved information need. But that doesn't give us enough, because we have queries like this: dissolvable stitches, 732 area code. And we don't know exactly what answer we're trying to go after. Do we want to know how long the dissolvable stitches last, what they're made of, what the brand name is? So here is where I say we turn to sort of a filtering heuristic. And we take advantage of the fact that a small number of searchers actually use question words or fully specified searches. How long do dissolvable stitches last? Where is the 732 area code? And if we get almost nothing in terms of that kind of a query, we don't know what we're going to be able to say, so we simply filter it out. We care more about precision here than recall. And finally, there are different kinds of answers, right? Something where I can answer with a short phrase, something where you might get a list. So like, here's how to change your password over a remote desktop, or actually summary syntheses of things. So what is the impact of budget cuts on teachers? Was a somewhat popular query in our data set. Not something we can easily answer with a single sentence. And in fact, you would probably need to go read a bunch in order to figure that out. I'm just going to focus for now with what we do on the short queries, which is starting to extract the answer from the page. So we now have these answer candidates with factual responses, succinct responses, but we don't know what they are. All we have is a query and a page. So now this is where I perhaps run around with a hammer that I have too often. We actually do turn to crowdsourcing. And we say we can't do this automatically. So we're going to ask folks for help. We're going to show them the page, the queries, and say, please extract what you need in order to answer this, or to show it to someone else who would have asked this question. Now, quality control was brought up. When we do this, this is kind of the equivalent of what we get. I'm obscuring the actual text. Just the point is that it's really long. But what we can start to do is develop quality control techniques here to say, this kind of, in this example, we know that this thing needs to show up, and this thing had better not be there. And when we start doing that, we actually get a slightly better response, which is closer to like a sentence or two. The reason I'm not showing actual text here is because it ends up being incredibly distracting. It's about really interesting things. Oh yeah. They're entering their conclave next week, and yeah. So we can produce these kinds of results. Given a whole bunch of search trails, we can produce about 20,000 answer candidates. Medium one triggered actually only once a day in our data set. It's about 350 times a year. And it costs about 44 cents to create each answer with the crowdsourcing technique that we use. So just briefly, I want to point out that when we hand-coded these, it was about 85% correct. As you saw, there were some things that had a typo of some sort, and others where the title, the thing that they said that they were trying to solve, actually did not match the content of what was copy-pasted out. And when we manipulate, this is getting to Gene's question, when we manipulate the presence of answers and the ranking quality of the search results, what we find is that these tail answers actually impact these ratings about half as much as ranking does. Which makes some sense because we're actually ranking, in effect, at the top a really good answer. But it does fully compensate for having really trash in the rest of your search results. Yeah?
I'm a little confused here. You
You use crowdsourcing to create these tail results,
Yes.
so there are real people responding.
Not in real time.
Okay, you're then presuming that this is going to be a useful result because someone's going to come along later.
That's right.
Ask that same question.
That's right.
And you said that over 50% of them only get asked once.
So there is this
So you're
incredible.
walking off the 50% that never get asked again.
Right. We're focusing on the queries that show
asked
up
maybe twice.
or
3 times.
Here we said. How often did I say? Once a day. So our training data was over several months. So we had enough data to actually understand more or less how common this kind of query would be. So yes, we're going to lag interest. You could think of some really interesting applications where we notice, oh my gosh, this thing is really spiking. We need to handcraft a search result very quickly. And then you might go off to the crowd, have it be edited, and then put that in front of users. But here we're doing it more or less offline for things that are sort of common, somewhat common needs. So, we have some interesting challenges. The crowd has a lot of editorial control. You can get this kind of thing happening where, we want to write about the Sea of China, but the crowd decides that we should be actually writing about the Sea of Japan. And also some ethical issues where we're now, again, cannibalizing page views from the original page. Google does this all the time. Is this something we actually want to push forward? And just as Gene was pointing out, we could use these same kind of techniques to go from a snippet that looks like this, where a snippet is the black text, to something that's actually, for example, authored a little bit more nicely, given the queries that we know are happening. Or producing domain-specific answers, saying, well, we know that there's an entire set of answers here which aren't being covered. People searching for how to concatenate strings in PHP, or produce that across multiple languages so that you could say, well, what's PHP array join look like in Python? Or go the other direction. What does Python's slicing syntax look like in PHP? And I'll close with just a few fresh ideas over the next 2 minutes or so. Just to give you a sense of the kinds of opportunities I see, these are a few things where I want to give shout outs to the rotation students who are working with me for the last 9 weeks. So these things are extremely fresh. Doing things like mining programming patterns off the web. For example, identifying patterns that real programmers use in real Ruby code, and then giving you the ability to say, actually, here's some other examples of how it's done. You could think about auto-completing. You could think about providing metadata or stronger compile time support for that kind of thing. Thinking about doing sensing for crowds locally. If we were to actually just hold up a phone or a laptop in this room, what could we learn about what people were doing just by listening to Wi-Fi traffic? So here we might be able to notice that everyone in this lecture is just actually looking at gizmodo.com, or that people are actually fairly statically sitting here rather than, say, a coffee shop where they're coming in and out all the time. So the previous project was done by Ethan. This one is by John and Will. Here's Joy and Justin, who were thinking about massive participatory fiction writing. If Neil Gaiman wanted to actually write a short story and have people contribute small parts of it, like leaving side stories open, would that be possible? Or kickstarting collective action by Justin, thinking about things like pure office hours, which we've actually deployed in CS 107 this quarter, sort of a Kickstarter kind of model where I'll do it if 20 other people also sign up. But here for volunteer efforts, something like I'll show up to these office hours if there are other people who are also going to show up, or I'll join this flash mob, but only if 20 other people do it too. So that's just a few pokes into the kinds of directions I'd love to push in, and some of the directions I've pushed in the past. And I would love to chat more, but in the meantime, I think you guys have a Friday afternoon to get back to. Thanks. Yes?
I seem to be sitting with the old folks here, the retirees. One of the things that I worry about in life in general, you're going to hear a lot of philosophy from me in the next 20 seconds, is about this kind of busy, low-level stuff from Mechanical Turk versus the kind of work where a guy thinks about a problem for 50 years and has. So I imagine a spectrum where you've got that. So, and my question to you is, with what you're endeavoring to do, how far along that spectrum can you push crowd work? What's your intuition on that?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that one interesting response you might have is, let's say you have this 50-year goal. Or,
I'm not saying that it's useless. But obviously the stuff that society really respects are those, the Nobel Prize winning work.
well, look at La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, right? This church that Gaudí, yes, designed and never lived to see the completion of. In fact, it's still not done. In a sense, you have this vision that was articulated at the beginning, and you have individuals who are continuing to realize it. So I think that's a really interesting question of having ideas that outlive perhaps even a single individual or short period. You could flip it around to another question, which would be, if I have something that's going to take me 50 years to complete, how could I actually engage with others to help me complete it either far better in 50 years or possibly in a shorter period of time? But yes, the little tiny tasks, I think, might not map well onto that.
I'm struck by the difference of point of view that you get to in crowdsourcing. If you start from something like Mechanical Turk on the one hand, as opposed to Yoshi Winkler and pure production.
Yes.
On the other hand, some of your latter examples were more like pure production. The difference is sort of the amount of control or lack of control and powerlessness you have in the one situation versus the initiative and ability to see the larger part and how you fit in the other. Or maybe there's other differences that just don't occur to me.
It's a really interesting.
If you take a scale of items for A and B, some of the Mechanical Turk things, like, do you see the whole that you're contributing to? No. Do you have power? No.
I'm not sure that there's a strict delineation between paid crowd work and unpaid pure production in this sense. One of the legitimate peripheral participation kinds of things that you see on Wikipedia, in fact, Mike Krieger did this kind of stuff with Scott, was identifying that people come in and all they start doing is reverting bad edits. And this is how people get started on Wikipedia. And I would claim that that's roughly isomorphic to doing little micro tasks. They're both crowdsourcing. I hesitate to try and come up with a concise definition of crowdsourcing. My rough one is asking a large set of people for help with something, which is not very precise, but has been useful so far because it adapts to whatever I mean at the moment. I think that really this may end up being a difference in some sense of intrinsic and extrinsic motivators, where with something like Wikipedia or the Polymath project, where people were all contributing to a huge math proof, you have people who are there because they want to be. And I think if you start to layer requirements and saying you must do it this way, it might be a little abrasive. I mean, this does happen, but Jimmy Wales does say Wikipedia is going to do this. He's the benevolent dictator model. But I think at the end of the day, you're there because you want to, not because I'm paying you.